Welcome back to Conquer Pathology with Dr. P. Today we are starting Module 4, which covers hemodynamics and vascular diseases. Our main topic today is the pulmonary plumbing, where we will untangle the details of pulmonary embolism, infarction, and the low pressure paradigm. Let's dive in. We begin by looking at the cardiovascular system, which produces the same output but at a fraction of the pressure. Let's look at the left ventricle. It pumps a volume of 5 liters per minute at a high pressure of 90 millimeters of mercury. Now compare that to the right ventricle. It also pumps a volume of 5 liters per minute but at a pressure of only 12 to 15 millimeters of mercury. This brings us to the paradigm. The right ventricle pumps the exact same blood volume as the muscular left ventricle but at a fraction of the pressure. So what is the mechanism behind this? How does the lung survive this massive flow? The answer is that the pulmonary vasculature is exceptionally thin-walled, highly distensible, and possesses massive reserve capacity to recruit closed capillaries when cardiac output spikes. Let's put this into context with Case Vignette 4.1. The 48-hour post-op ambush. Our patient profile is a 70-year-old male who is 2 days post-op from a total right hip arthroplasty. Looking at the event timeline, Step 1. He ambulated to the bathroom. Step 2. He experienced sudden chest pain. Step 3. Gasping for air. Step 4. Collapse. And Step 5. A PEA cardiac arrest. As you can see on the bedside echo, there is massive RV dilation and it is poorly contracting. Our bedside echo findings confirm a massively dilated and hypokinetic right ventricle. This leaves us with the critical diagnostic query: what silent killer just traveled from his calf to his lung? To answer that, we must understand that 95% of pulmonary emboli originate from lower leg DVTs, specifically originating in the popliteal, femoral, and iliac veins. They are dictated by Virchow's triad. Think of Virchow's triad as the lock to deep vein thrombosis. It has 3 components. First is stasis of blood flow, seen in situations like post-op bed rest or long-haul flights. Second is hypercoagulability, driven by factors like factor V Leiden, active malignancy, or oral contraceptives. Third is endothelial injury caused by events like surgical trauma or orthopedic reaming. Let's trace this path from calf to catastrophe. This is the anatomical journey of the clot. Step 1. The clot breaks free from the popliteal or femoral vein in the lower leg. Step 2. It shoots upward through the right channel of the inferior vena cava. Step 3. It enters the right atrium and passes into the right ventricle. Finally, Step 4. It slams into the narrow bifurcation of the pulmonary artery. That impact point leads us to the bottleneck, the saddle embolus. The mechanism here is deadly simple. A massive long coiled DVT sails smoothly through wide venous channels until it hits the very first narrow bottleneck, which is the pulmonary arterial tree. By definition, a saddle embolus is an embolus that physically straddles the bifurcation of the main pulmonary artery, occluding both the right and the left branches simultaneously. Why does a massive PE kill instantly? It is due to the dual catastrophe of a saddle embolus. Let's look at pathway 1, mechanical obstruction. Because the pulmonary artery is blocked, we get an empty left ventricle. Number 1, blood cannot reach the lungs. Number 2, left ventricular preload drops to 0. Number 3, cardiac output crashes. The result of this pathway is systemic hypotension and shock. Now let's look at pathway 2, neurohumoral vasoconstriction. The trapped platelets degranulate, vomiting out serotonin and thromboxane A2. This triggers intense brainless vasoconstriction of the patent pulmonary arteries. Because of this, the right ventricular afterload spikes. The result is acute cor pulmonale or right heart failure. Let's shift gears to the 10% rule. Why are pulmonary infarcts rare? This comes down to the dual blood supply protection mechanism. The rule is that only around 10% of pulmonary emboli cause true tissue infarction. Let's look at the anatomy of this dual blood supply. The lung is protected by a dual plumbing system. Even with a blocked pulmonary artery from an embolus, the lung receives systemic oxygen-rich backup directly from the bronchial arteries branching off the aorta, providing collateral flow. Therefore, the clinical requirement for true tissue necrosis to occur is that the patient almost always has compromised bronchial backup, for example, a pre-existing left-sided heart failure or underlying lung disease. If an infarct does occur, what does it look like? Looking at the anatomy of a pulmonary infarct on our gross pathology evidence board, we first notice the shape. It is wedge-shaped. The base of the lesion rests against the pleural surface and the apex points directly towards the occluded vessel at the hilum. Next is the color. It is hemorrhagic, meaning it is profoundly red. Why is it red? Because collateral blood from the bronchial arteries continues to seep into the necrotic tissue. The dead capillaries then leak red blood cells directly into the alveoli. Let's look at the microscopic pathology and clinical correlation of that red wedge. At the cellular level, the histology reveals coagulated necrosis of the alveolar walls, which are densely packed and stuffed with extravasated erythrocytes. Moving to the patient level, the clinical link is that over 48 hours, the overlying pleura develops fibrinous pleuritis. This explains why non-fatal PE patients present complaining of sharp localized pleuritic chest pain. It is time for Dr. P's exam cheat code, the forensic clot matrix. A common question for pathologists is, did the DVT kill them or did they die with it? Let's compare. For an antemortem thrombus, the defining feature is that lines of Zahn are present. The appearance shows distinct laminations of pale pink platelets and fibrin alternating with dark red erythrocytes. The mechanism is that this requires flowing blood to form. This means the DVT killed them. Conversely, a post-mortem clot has the feature of no lines of Zahn. The appearance is dark red and gelatinous, characterized as a uniform classic currant jelly or chicken fat appearance. The mechanism here is that it formed in stagnant blood after death. Let's wrap up with the pulmonary plumbing. Hemodynamics synthesized. Here's your Module 4 master summary. Number 1. The paradigm. It is a low pressure system. The right ventricle delicately pumps 5 liters per minute at 12 to 15 millimeters of mercury. Number 2. The source. 95% originate from lower leg DVTs dictated by the 3 elements of Virchow's triad. Number 3. The kill mechanism. It is a combination of mechanical shock due to zero LV preload paired with neurohumoral core pulmonale caused by serotonin and thromboxane A2 vasoconstriction. Number 4. The infarct and proof. The infarct is wedge-shaped and red due to collateral seepage, and it requires a compromised bronchial supply to form. And remember, the presence of lines of Zahn indicates it was antemortem. Continuing with Module 15, the lung, we are diving deep into the hemodynamic crisis. We will be completely unraveling the pathology of pulmonary hypertension. Let's get started. Let's introduce our clinical scenario for today with Case Vignette 4.2, the young woman's syncope. Looking at our pressure tracing, we note a diastolic of 25, a systolic greater than 55, and an AMPAP of 34. Our patient is a 26-year-old woman with no past medical history. She presents with progressive exertional dyspnea and 2 recent episodes of fainting or syncope while climbing stairs. On physical exam, she has a loud, palpable P2 heart sound and a parasternal heave. A right heart catheterization reveals a resting mean pulmonary artery pressure or AMPAP of 34 mm of mercury, but a completely normal pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. A critical piece of her family history is that her maternal aunt died of unexplained heart failure at age 30. Keep this question in mind: what gene is mutated in this young woman? First, let's start by defining the hemodynamic threat. By definition, pulmonary hypertension is an AMPAP greater than or equal to 25 mm of mercury. To put that in perspective, normal resting pressure is less than or equal to 20 mm of mercury. So going back to our vignette, our 26-year-old patient presented with a resting AMPAP of 34 mm of mercury. This places her definitively into the category of severe pulmonary hypertension. To figure out why she has this, we use the WHO classification diagnostic map, which divides the causes into 5 groups. Group 1 is pulmonary arterial hypertension or PAH. The causes here include idiopathic, familial, and the BMPR2 mutation. Group 2 is driven by left heart diseases with causes like mitral stenosis or left ventricular failure. Group 3 is driven by lung diseases with causes being COPD, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, obstructive sleep apnea, and chronic hypoxia. Group 4 is caused by chronic pulmonary embolism, specifically CTEPH, which stands for chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension from unresolved thrombi. Finally, Group 5 is multifactorial, including causes like sarcoidosis and hematologic disorders. Let's look back at our patient for a moment, isolating the suspect to idiopathic or familial PAH. The callback clue from her history was that her maternal aunt died at age 30. This points us directly to the BMPR2 gene, which stands for bone morphogenetic protein receptor type 2. This mutation is found in up to 80% of familial cases, and it is also found in 20% of sporadic cases. The mechanism of this receptor is that it normally signals via the TGF-beta pathway. However, when you have inactivating mutations, they trigger the total collapse of vascular homeostasis. I want you to think of this mutation as the cut brake line. An intact BMPR2 acts as a molecular brake pedal on vascular smooth muscle and endothelial proliferation. As long as it is functioning, homeostasis is maintained. But when BMPR2 is mutated, the brake line is cut. Without those brakes, the endothelial and smooth muscle cell undergo brainless runaway proliferation. The proliferation causes a dangerous biochemical shift in the pulmonary vessels. On one hand, our key vasodilators, nitric oxide and prostacyclin, have decreased synthesis. This results in a severe loss of vascular relaxation. On the other hand, endothelin-1, which is a potent vasoconstrictor and mitogen, sees increased synthesis. This leads to uncontrolled constriction and cell growth. Let's look at the microscopic wreckage caused by this shift through the vascular remodeling pipeline. Step 1 is the normal structure, where we see thin walls and uninhibited blood flow. In step 2, we develop medial hypertrophy. We see a thickened smooth muscle layer in the small pulmonary arteries, which causes the lumen to narrow. Finally, in step 3, we see intimal thickening. This is a concentric fibrosis of the intima, creating a classic onion skin appearance that severely restricts blood flow. Ultimately, this process leads to the pathognomic hallmark of this disease, plexiform lesions. When pulmonary artery pressures reach catastrophic levels in group 1 PAH, the endothelial cells proliferate into a tangled, chaotic tuft of multiple tiny capillary-like channels right inside the lumen of a small artery. As you can see comparing these images, a plexiform lesion in the lung is looking literally like a macroscope glomerulus inside the lung. To truly understand the hemodynamics here, imagine navigating the plexiform maze from the perspective of a RBC. Trying to push a RBC through a severe plexiform lesion is literally trying to navigate a matrix. The corridor is blocked, there are dead ends everywhere, the walls are closing in, and the right ventricle is back there blowing out its transmission trying to force you through. How do we treat this? We use the Pharmacology Target Map for fixing the endothelium. Target 1 addresses endothelin 1 using bosentan or ambrisentan. These are endothelin 1 receptor antagonists acting as a shield and blocking the heavy vasoconstrictor. Target 2 targets nitric oxide using sildenafil or tadalafil. These are PDE5 inhibitors. They keep the cGMP high to enhance nitric oxide vasodilation. Target 3 addresses prostacyclin using epoprostenol or iloprost. These are synthetic prostacyclin analogs that directly replace lost PGI2 to push the balance down and promote vasodilation. Let's wrap this up with Dr. P's exam cheat codes. First, the core mnemonic to remember the gene. Think of BMPR2 as the brake mechanism for pulmonary remodeling 2. Next, watch out the exam trap regarding inheritance. It is autosomal dominant with incomplete penetrance. Also, beware of the classic demographic trap. On exam questions, always look for the young female with unexplained right heart failure and a family history. Which brings us to our final case resolution for Vignette 4.2. The 26-year-old female has familial group 1 PAH due to BMPR2 mutation. Her syncope is due to right ventricular strain pushing against those plexiform lesions. Her treatment begins immediately with targeted endothelial therapy, utilizing drugs like bosentan combined with sildenafil. Next, we are looking at what I call the deadly duo, diffuse alveolar hemorrhage and Goodpasture syndrome. Let's get right into it. We will start with a clinical case. Here's a patient profile, a 22-year-old male who is a heavy smoker. His primary presentation is massive hemolysis, meaning he is coughing up bright red blood, combined with severe fatigue. Let's look at his vitals and labs. His hemoglobin has plummeted to 7.2 grams per deciliter, indicating severe iron deficiency anemia. His urine analysis shows hematuria along with RBC casts. Finally, his serum creatinine is spiked at 3.4 milligrams per deciliter, pointing to acute renal failure. When we perform a biopsy to investigate, we use a direct immunofluorescence or DIF micrograph mount. This renal biopsy reveals smooth, linear, ribbon-like IgG deposition all along the glomerular basement membrane. So the key question for us to answer is, what autoantibody is attacking this young man? The answer is Goodpasture syndrome. This diagnosis requires a classic triad. First, massive hemolysis. Second, rapidly progressive glomerular nephritis. And third, that smooth linear IgG immunofluorescence we just saw. From an immunological standpoint, remember that this is the prototype type 2 or cytotoxic hypersensitivity. But what is the actual target of this hypersensitivity? The target is found in exactly 2 places in the human body. It is specifically the non-collagenous or NC1 domain of the alpha-3 chain of type 4 collagen. You will find this specific molecular target exclusively in the glomerular basement membrane or GBM and the alveolar basement membrane. Let's look at how the destruction happens in the lungs, step by step, starting with complement protein C3b. Step 1 is bind. Circulating IgG autoantibodies attach directly to the alveolar capillaries. Step 2 is amplify. the classical complement cascade is activated, resulting in a massive C5a spike. Step 3 is destroy. Drawn by that spike, neutrophils rush in, chemically obliterating the delicate alveolar capillary barrier. Finally, step 4 is flood. The barrier breaks and the massive amounts of RBCs flood directly into the alveolar spaces. Once the bleeding stops, in comes the cleanup crew. The alveolar spaces are now flooded with fresh erythrocytes. To handle this, we see the arrival of hemosiderin-laden macrophages. These alveolar macrophages spend weeks digesting the carnage. As they process the RBCs, they eventually become permanently stuffed with iron. Now for a high-yield exam trap, the smoking trigger. You might be asked, why do some Goodpasture patients only get kidney failure without the lung hemorrhage? It comes down to the shield. The alpha-3 antigen in the lung is normally hidden deep inside the basement membrane, so antibodies simply cannot reach it. However, we have the trigger. Factors like heavy cigarette smoking, hydrocarbon solvents, or viral infections strip away that protective endothelial lining. As a result, the hidden antigen is suddenly exposed, directly leading to explosive fatal hemolysis. This is exactly why our 22-year-old heavy smoker presented this way. Let's compare this with similar conditions using our diagnostic matrix. For Goodpasture syndrome, the immunological mechanism is a type 2 hypersensitivity. The renal immunofluorescence pattern shows linear IgG, and the key serology is a positive anti-GBM. For granulomatosis with polyangiitis, historically known as Wegener's, the mechanism is a small vessel necrotizing vasculitis. The renal immunofluorescence pattern is posse-immune, meaning it is negative or blank. The key serology is positive C-ANCA or anti-PR3. Finally, for idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis, the mechanism is unknown, but it typically presents in young children with no renal disease. The renal immunofluorescence pattern is negative, and they have negative serologies, but the condition notably responds to steroids. Let's sum up this hemodynamics module. Drop the wrench, plumbing inspection is complete. Let's review what we have covered. For pulmonary embolism or PE, remember that 95% originate from lower leg DVTs. A saddle embolus causes acute right ventricular failure via serotonin and thromboxane vasoconstriction. Look for wedge-shaped red infarcts and antemortem lines of Zahn. For pulmonary arterial hypertension or PAH, it is defined by an MPAP greater than or equal to 25 mm of mercury. Group 1 is linked to BMPRD mutations where endothelin spikes and nitric oxide drops, and the end-stage hallmark is plexiform lesions. And Goodpasture syndrome is driven by anti-alpha-3 type 4 collagen IgG causing hemolysis and nephritis. Look for linear IgG ribbons on renal immunofluorescence and sputum containing hemosiderin-laden macrophages. You guys are absolute troopers. Over my 13 years of teaching, I know this is the point where mental fatigue usually sets in. So stretch your backs and take a deep breath. Next up is part 5, the invaders. We will be comparing lobar versus bronchopneumonia, discussing the atypical walkers, examining tuberculosis cavities, and identifying opportunistic ICU fungi. Until then, keep pushing forward, keep trusting your revision, and conquer pathology.